Welcome back. All right, let us discuss the Montreal Canadiens. The Montreal Canadiens came into the month of December right near the bottom of the league. Even now, in the overall standings, they're 23rd in the National Hockey League. They have some teams to jump over if they want to get into a playoff spot, but now they're 3 points back. They are 3 points out of a playoff spot. So the 11-16-3 record through 30 games heading into December would tell you this team was having its struggles. And then they get the benefit of a weaker schedule, which seems to have gotten them some confidence, and now that confidence is showing through against stronger teams. So it starts with a 6-1 win at home against Buffalo. Buffalo has had a miserable season. Montreal led that one 2-1 after, or 2-0, I should say, after the first. Montembeault had 20 saves on 21 shots in that game. And Montembeault has been played a lot. We'll talk about that too. So the next game they win on the road in Detroit 4-3. That game was tied 2-2 after the first. Montembeault saves 25 out of 28. Then they come back home. They win 5-1 against the Detroit Red Wings. They led that game 3-1 after the first. Montembeault 20 saves on 21 shots. And of course, Detroit has got rid of their coach not too long after that. So the Detroit Red Wings winning those back-to-back, beating Buffalo, those are wins that a team should be able to get, right? Montreal gets those. Then they go on the road to Columbus. They lost that game 5-4, and it was a definite up and down kind of game for the Montreal Canadiens. They trailed 3-1 in the second. They led 4-3 in the third. Ultimately, they lost the game 5-4. Montembeault, 27 saves on 32 shots, and it was obvious that Montembeault was probably getting overplayed. So they call up Dobesh because they didn't have any faith left in Caden Primo. Now, I would hope that Caden Primo at this stage in his career can get his game back. I think that he's young enough to do so, but I also understand why he cleared waivers. Now, the first game that they give Dobesh was an eyebrow raiser because it's Florida. In Florida. So if a goaltender's going to make his debut and you're going to give him the most difficult job, potentially one of the most difficult jobs anyways for a National Hockey League goaltender, I would say starting your career in Florida against a Panthers team that, it should be a little bit ornery with how often they've been shut out. Winning that one on the road 4-0 says a lot. And so that was the start of the current road trip. That game, Montreal led 3-0 after 2, and the vaunted Florida comeback they tried, but Dobesh said no, and 34 saves on 34 shots. In his first NHL game, Dobesh shuts out Florida in Florida. So that makes a big statement there. Then on the road again in Tampa, they win 5-2. They led that one 1-0 after one and 3-2 after the second period. And once again, I was thinking, well, Montreal's had a pretty good game. I don't know if they're going to win this, but they've had a pretty good game going into the third, and then they win it. Montembeault saves 21 out of 23 in that one. Then last night, they won 3-2 on the road in Las Vegas. What's interesting with that one is they trailed 2-0 after one. Montembeault saves 27 out of 29. And Vegas fans weren't happy, but while we can look at the standings and say, well, Vegas should have won that, the reality is Montreal's kind of becoming giant killers. It's kind of what they're doing, and it started with winning 3 out of 4 against teams that are at or near the bottom of the league standings, and it says a lot about this team's ability to win games they shouldn't. Now, what's interesting is their next game is kind of looking like a trap game. So on the 3rd of January, they're in Chicago. And what I think makes it more of a trap game is on the 4th, they're in Denver. There's always that chance that a team might just assume, okay, we'll beat Chicago and then we move on to Colorado. We'll see if we see that from Montreal. Colorado is not going to be an easy game. I would totally understand why players would look at the schedule and say, we got Colorado tomorrow, huh? But the back-to-backs in Chicago and then in Denver, that's not easy, and we'll see how Montreal comes out of that. Then they come back home for one. On the 6th, they're playing at home against Vancouver. We know that Vancouver right now is going through their struggles. It's been a rough season for Vancouver, comparatively speaking, with what was expected of them this season. So, winnable game? I would say yes. Then they go on the road to Washington on the 10th of January. That's going to be an interesting one because Washington has been very unpredictable lately. Sometimes, like yesterday against Boston, they played their games, they looked really well. Their previous game against Boston, they didn't. So we'll see which Washington team, and I'm just comparing the two Boston games with Washington. I'm a Bruins fan, so I did, notice maybe a little bit more. But at any rate, Montreal then comes back home the next day to play against Dallas. So this is a tough back-to-back. You're in Washington, then you come home and you play against Dallas. So of the 5 games on the board, I would say that almost all of them look like they'll be good tests for where Montreal is at currently. Because while Vancouver's had their struggles, they do still have a good road record. But yeah, watch that one in Chicago on the 3rd. If they go out there and they beat Chicago like 4-0 or 5-1, the East is on notice at that point. So the month of December was a good one for some of the players that you want to see producing if you're a Montreal fan. Starting with Cole Caulfield, 14 games, 5 goals, 9 assists, 14 points. And tied in points with him, Nick Suzuki, because of course, 14 games, 2 goals, 12 assists, 14 points. It feels like these two are tied together, so that if one's struggling, the other's struggling as well. And I really think that when Montreal becomes a playoff team again, and maybe this is the season. Sure, we can go down that rabbit hole and say maybe this is the season. Montreal makes themselves relevant, get above that playoff line. Suzuki and Caulfield, we could look back on this and say all of the trials and tribulations they had along that time of rebuilding for Montreal could very well make them battle hardened and make them better and a little more impressive in the playoffs than what we might have seen if they hadn't gone through that. Lane Hutson has been a story and may very well end up being the winner of the Calder this year. I wouldn't be surprised anyways. 14 games, 2 goals, 11 assists, 13 points. As a defenseman, if you're scoring about a point per game, as a rookie defenseman, if you're scoring about a point per game, that's excellent. So, could it be Celebrini's? Sure. Beachkov? Absolutely. Wolf in Calgary? Yep. But Hutson has to be in there with those other 3 too. Then you've got Evans. Evans kind of came out of nowhere this month. 14 games, 6 goals, 6 assists for 12 points. The points for Evans now match his work ethic. I've always been impressed with Evans' work ethic. When he was a 4th-line center, I kept thinking, well, maybe there's more there. And I think maybe 4 years ago I was talking about Evans and how there might be more there. And I haven't talked about that lately, but maybe there is. 12 points in 14 games is excellent. Speaking of rookies, Emil Heineman, who doesn't get any attention when it comes to Calder, 14 games, 4 goals, 5 assists, 9 points. I don't expect him to be a Calder finalist or anything like that, but Heineman's going to have a very good career in the National Hockey League. Armia, 14 games, 5 goals, 3 assists, 8 points. We'll talk about him again before this is done. Slavkovsky has not been part of this build of Montreal. 14 games, 2 goals, 5 assists, 7 points. Slavkovsky's had his struggles this season, which makes it more interesting with Montreal because Caulfield and Suzuki are going, things are going pretty well. If Slavkovsky could jump in and get a bunch of points as well, you're in luck. And then, of course, I should have mentioned, and Laine's name is on the board, but I went straight from Evans to Heineman. Laine in 13 games this month, 8 goals, 2 assists, 10 points. He scores on the power play a lot. You're going to have defensive issues with him 5-on-5. It's just the nature of Laine's game. But if he's scoring like this, it's worth it. It is absolutely worth it. The discussion of his one-way play has gone back to when he was a rookie in Winnipeg. And I don't think Laine's going to change, but I don't think Montreal has any interest in him changing. I think they figure they've got enough forwards that can play on the defensive side. Laine gives them that pure goal scorer, right? And if Laine can continue to tee off on the power play the way he did this month, things bode well for him, keeping in mind he is an unrestricted free agent in 2026. So Montreal, as soon as this summer, or maybe even going into this summer, might be wise to sit down, talk to Laine, and see what he's looking for in that next contract, and whether or not they can work something out well in advance of even worrying about him becoming a free agent. Now, Montembeault had a good month. 8-4 record, 909 save percentage. So the fact that he had 8 wins, his 909 save percentage is good. Not fantastic, but good. Dobesh won the only game he played, shutout, so his save percentage is perfect. Primo 0-1 with a 778 save percentage. And I think Primo's numbers were ugly enough that it would scare off virtually anybody who was looking at bringing in a goaltender. Because if you bring in Primo, you're going to have to waive your own backup. So you have to see Primo as an upgrade over what you've already got on your roster. My guess is that GMs looked at Caden Primo's recent track record and said it's a little too risky. He's a good young goaltender. I still think there's something there. And we'll see if spending time in Laval helps him out. Because Dobesh definitely looks ready. I know it's one game, but just his positioning and how well he played and how cool and calm he was against Florida, It was impressive. There was no indication that he was a rookie. I didn't see any jitters from him at all. Now, the team's playing well. 47 goals scored in the month of December, 40 goals against, 21.6% on the power play, and the penalty kill, 84.8%. So the combined number, about 106.4 exactly, actually. 106.4, excellent number on your special teams. 110, and that's the combination of power play and penalty kill. You add those two numbers together. If it's 110 or higher, that's considered elite. So Montreal's almost in the elite category, I think in large part due to Patrick Laine returning to the lineup. Now, their shots, they get 27.1 shots per game. They're allowing 28.7 shots per game. Again, this is just in the month of December. That is one thing to keep an eye on. It means that they're probably not driving as much of the play over the month of December, but it was a pretty good month for them. So scoring by period, and this is interesting because it shows how things have gotten better for them. And I'm hoping I explain this in a way that doesn't just become a bunch of numbers thrown at everybody. So this month, in the first period, they scored and allowed 14 goals. In the second period, they scored 19 and they allowed 11. So they're very good with the long change. Third period, not as much, scoring 13 and allowing 15. In the overtime, they scored the only goal. The overall number, 30 goals scored in the first period, 39 goals against, meaning that coming into this month, they were a -9. Coming out of this month, they were -9 as well. So coming into this month, it was 16 goals scored, 25 goals against through the first periods. Second period, overall, they're at 42 goals scored and 41 goals against, meaning that coming into this month, they had scored 23 and they'd allowed 30. So a big part of the turnaround for Montreal is they are much better in second periods now than they were going into the month of December. Third periods have remained a bit of a concern. 38 goals scored, 44 goals against. Coming into this month, 25 goals scored, 29 goals against. So they actually got worse by a couple of goals. But that second period, been very good for them. In overtime, the fact they've scored 1 goal, that means altogether they have 2 goals scored, 2 goals against. So coming into this month, they'd scored once, they'd allowed 2. It's not a big deal when it comes to the overtime. 3-on-3 is very much a coin toss. Whoever wins the face-off has a good chance. Like I'm talking, the initial face-off has a good chance of winning. That's part of the reason why when I take notes on overtimes, I put down who controls off that first face-off because I know that's an important part of the game. Now, their current cap space is interesting. If Kent Hughes decided, you know what, I'd like to add to this roster, he can. $7,547,500 in cap space. And there are some players here who they could rent out at the deadline, which would create further cap space. And not all of these are big deals in terms of players. Now, Dvorak is an example. I don't think if they decide to move Dvorak that means they're selling. I think Montreal might get rid of a couple of pending unrestricted free agents with the idea of adding assets. And then they could add. They could absolutely go out and pick up players at the same time. I would be fascinated to see that happen. Armia, pending UFA. I don't think Armia is going anywhere. Evans, the smartest thing Ken Hughes can do right now is sit down with Evans and discuss a contract extension before it might get more expensive as the season goes along. And then you've got Savard. Reporting as recently as a week or two ago was Montreal's had no extension talks with David Savard. With the depth they have on the blue line, I'd be very surprised if they don't move Savard. So of the 4 pending UFAs, Dvorak probably gets traded. Savard probably gets traded. If it's just purely they get rid of those contracts, maybe they retain part, it should add to their cap space. Or maybe you rent them out somewhere and the player you're getting back is somebody you feel can help you down the stretch looking towards a potential playoff spot. I don't think Kent Hughes is going to take their current run as a sign that he can just go out and start buying up players and okay, now we can add a bunch. But it does make things a little more interesting for Montreal. And I've always said as a Boston fan, the NHL is more entertaining for me to follow when Montreal's good than when they're not. So when I hear people say, he's a Boston fan, he doesn't want Montreal to win. You kidding me? There's nothing better than a Boston-Montreal Stanley Cup playoff series. Absolutely, those are some of my favorites, even though sometimes they've made me very angry because Montreal does have a very good track record against Boston. Look at the history series over the summer. But it's this classic matchup. It's this matchup that it takes me back to my childhood. And I absolutely, because every year, Montreal-Boston, round 1 or round 2, it was coming. and it was always unpredictable, and it was always fun to watch. So I'd love to see Montreal get into the playoffs. I'd love to see a Montreal-Boston matchup at some point soon in the playoffs once again. So we'll see if that does happen. So let me know your thoughts. What do you think Montreal needs? Do you think they need more offense? Do you think they need to maybe add a goaltender? Maybe with Dobesh, he can be the backup here and there, but maybe it's better to have him in Laval for another year. Maybe you add a more NHL experienced backup at the deadline, something like that. Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support as always. It's greatly appreciated. I will talk to you again soon.